Hello, this is Dangerous Minds. I'm Richard Metzger, and today my guest is Timothy Wyllie, the author of a new book called Love, Sex, Fear, and Death, the inside story of the Process Church of the Final Judgment. Timothy, welcome. It's good to see you again.
Thank you, Richard. Good to be here.
So I want to begin at the beginning. For the people who are watching this who have no idea what the Process Church of the Final Judgment was, what was it, I guess?
The process started in around 1964, and it started as a psychotherapy technology, actually. And then as we got further and further into the psychology, we started to become a community, started living together as a community in England, and then after a certain amount of time, basically England, I think, got a little fed up with us.
Right.
Or we certainly got fed up with England, so we moved.
Well, let me take it back a minute. So the process was an offshoot of Scientology. The three people who were the first processions, yourself and the founders, Robert and Marianne de Grimston, you were all studying Scientology?
No, I certainly wasn't. I had nothing to do with Scientology. But Robert and Marianne were in Scientology for a short time. And they did actually very well there, especially Marianne. She's a very bright woman. But they found that the use of this e-meter that the Scientologists used, that they could actually work with it in a much more efficient way than Hubbard was using it.
Right, well, the e-meter is like a lie detector.
It's kind of a primitive lie detector which detects from the sweat on the fingers or on the hands. The different ways of explaining it, but what it does is it picks up the emotional charge that somebody has. For instance, if you have a blockage, a psychological blockage, that actually gets trapped in the body. And you can see it from how the meter, the elaboration of the needle on the meter will tell you how much of an emotional charge that you're carrying. And we found that we were able to actually strip away these various different compulsions. And as we stripped the compulsions away, more spiritual information started to emerge.
They were in Scientology, they leave, and then they found, you said compulsions. They start something called compulsions analysis.
Correct.
Now, you were the third, not the third, but I guess you were the first.
I think I was the first. Yes, I think I was the first person because I was an old friend of Robert. We studied architecture together. I think Marianne had one of her clients also, but I didn't know him at the time. But yes, they kind of used me as a guinea pig to get their technology straight, and of course I became involved with it because it's wonderful technology and it was really very helpful.
Yeah, I've always found that whatever people say about Scientology, and I'm not saying this for or against it, there are always certain techniques that are involved in any kind of, psychological, self-help kind of thing that are of benefit to certain people, and that's why they carry on with it, and other people don't find those benefits.
I agree entirely, and I think a lot of especially with Scientology, a lot of the early technology in Scientology was very good. A lot of the group work they were doing, and we took, I think, 2 or 3 different techniques from them, but it was really very, very different from Scientology.
How did other people come to join first compulsions analysis and then the process? What was the mechanism by which people would come into the fold?
Well, I can speak personally. The more I did it, and I think probably I did it for about 4 or 5 months, and I had quite a wide circle of friends at that point, and they could see the changes in me and were curious about it.
How old were you at the time?
23 perhaps, 22, 23, something like that. So that's how some people came, and then other friends of friends came. They started something called a communication course, which was on 2 evenings a week, and that was open to the public, and maybe 30 or 40 people would come, and Marianne and Robert would be up there, and they'd be doing their magic. Robert was very intellectual and cerebral, and Marianne very intuitive and psychic, and they were actually, to begin with, a very good match. They worked very well, so it was a very exciting thing, and it was in the 60s, and it was an alternative in a sense to the swinging London scene that was happening. It went much deeper than the rather more superficial aspects of London at that point.
Well, what about the theology of the process? I mean, you're talking about right around that time, the swinging London, Carnaby Street era, about 1966. I would think prior to that era. It's almost like, you know, when the Beatles sort of become color. You know, they go from being the Fab Four and kind of innocent to being like the hippie sort of leaders that they became. That prior to 1965, London must have seemed a very drab place to be. But also, did the apocalyptic ideas of the cult, were these like post-war ideas? Did it seem like if you were living in Europe at the time and you were a young person that you were amongst the ruins or some sort of bombed out? I mean, do you know what I'm saying? It's like,
yes,
was it a reaction to that?
Of course, it was very much of a subtext. I mean, you know, I was born in 1940, and my first memories were the bomb dropping, dropping on the village that I lived in, and I'm sure that many of the others of us had the same experiences. So the idea that we were living under this atomic threat was very, very real indeed. You know, the apocalypse was round the corner. You know, we couldn't see any way that it would be avoided. So I think that's where it really emerged from. And then as we became more self-aware, we began contrasting what we thought was the unawareness of everybody around, and we could see that...
The grey forces.
The grey forces, if you like, yeah. But the theology didn't really emerge until New Orleans, until we got to America, because we went through a whole process. We were, in a sense, we left England, I think, in '66 or something like that, '67, and then went to the Bahamas and stayed there for a while, and then we ended up in Mexico, and that's really where the psychic impulse of the gods, and we call them the beings at that point. But that's where it really started. And then when we got to New Orleans and incorporated as a church, we had to formalize our theology.
Right. Now, what was that theology? There was the idea of the opposites, the reconciliation of the opposites.
That really was the fundamental, and
it's based on a Christian archetype, which is kind of a bit odd.
Well,
but
is it? I mean,
Jesus, Satan, Jehovah. I mean, so, you know, it's all.
Yes. Well, obviously, and we were working within a Western cosmology, if you like. You know, if we had been in Japan, we might have mapped it against a totally different kind of cosmology. But that's the one we used. But it's a little more complicated than the Christian thing, because we had these three basic archetypes of Jehovah, Lucifer, and Satan, and then we saw the Christ aspect as being the unifier. And then the more complicated and more fundamental scenario came from the concept of loving your enemy. And as Robert would say, you know, who was Christ's enemy? Satan was Christ's enemy. So the idea was to, through love, uniting the opposites, uniting these different aspects. And of course it was an internal process, an alchemical process of uniting the two aspects of the self.
Well, when you said a moment ago that there were the Jehovians.
Yeah.
So within the process, there were people who identified with Jehovah, there were people who identified with Lucifer, there were people who identified with Satan. Is that correct?
Yes.
So, like, let's say that someone who has the bent towards Satan, were these people the more amoral processions, or does it not really work that way?
No, it didn't work really like that. It was what one has to deal with internally. For instance, a Jehovian might be very authoritarian and you know, direct and everything like that. Maybe too much so. So the Jehovian would learn to ease back on that aspect, and just as somebody who identified within the Satan group would also have to deal with the passions and, as you say, immoral thoughts and things like that, but dealing with them rather than acting them out.
So someone who's Luciferian is more freewheeling?
Yeah, laid back, perhaps a little more whimsical, easygoing.
Now, were these distinctions put on the members, on the processions by the upper management, as it were? I mean, did you say, well, we've done an auditing session with you, you seem more to be a Jehovian than this? I mean, or was this something that someone self-identified and said, well, yes, I'm more of a satanic person, or I'm more of a this or a that? How did that
sure
work?
There was a little bit of the imposition that must have gone on through the years, but on the whole it was very much a self-identification. And as we became, both the cosmology and we became more complicated, so also we started to subdivide. So, for instance, I would classify myself as a Lucifer Satan, as opposed to, because I don't have much of that, you know, Jehovah.
But you're talking about personality
Yes.
attributes here.
Yes.
So, but there's a moment in time when it goes from being like a distinction, if you will, a psychological distinction, into being something that's more theologically and religious in its orientation.
Yes.
And that's when the game of the gods and some of the writings and this theology comes in.
True.
How does that work? When does that happen? It seems to me that there's a sort of a point where it sort of flips into the other camp, if you will.
I don't think it was quite such a dramatic flip. I think it was more an incremental movement towards looking for where these archetypes come from. You see, when we got to the Bahamas, we'd already been meditating a lot, and we started meditating in a group, and a lot of us, and ultimately all of us, started feeling in contact with what at that point we call the beings. And it was the beings then. We would go into meditation, we'd ask a question from the beings, right? And then afterwards we'd all sit around and say the answers we got.
I'm not understanding if it goes from being a psychological distinction, like if you say to somebody, you're an uptight person, or you're someone who suffers from anxiety, you're not thinking in terms of some kind of being, or you see what I'm saying? I'm trying to understand this myself, and for the viewers, where does that happen? I mean, like, at what point did you start taking these psychological archetypes and ascribing that there was some kind of conscious being who was influencing your behavior, or?
I think that what was happening is that as we stripped away the psychological compulsions, the spiritual aspects of us came through. For instance, if I was to ask you, what are you here to achieve? You might answer, make a lot of money. You might say, write a book. Or if you cut beneath those, you might say, to help humanity, to serve God. You find underneath the mental, the psychological layer is the spiritual layer. And once you get into the spiritual layer, of course, you're looking out. It's a much larger frame.
But the idea that messages are coming towards you, that's where the leap is, I guess what I'm trying to say.
Yes, it was a rather mysterious thing, in a sense, because it wasn't imposed. It was a real sense that we had cleared ourselves out so much at that point that we could hear, we could listen much more deeply. And out of that came firstly the beings, and then when we got to Mexico, to Yucatan, where we lived for about 9 months there, the presence there was so strong that I think that was when we started to see the bigger frame, that it wasn't just about us, that there were larger entities, larger forces out there, of which we were part of.
So it becomes a messianic cult at that point?
Yes, yes, it was very messianic, yeah.
Well, so what were you trying to do if you brought people in, what was the thing that they were going to get from it?
Well, there were two aspects to it. To begin with, we thought we could really help, we could really change the world. I think it took about 9 months before we realized it was completely absurd. Oh. And we, I think probably unwisely, took a slightly oppositional role to what was happening in the world. And out of that came that feeling, which I think is very common to a lot of cults and religious sects, which is, we're special. We're the elect. You don't know what we're talking about.
Us against them.
You're out there, we are. And we're going to be the ones who are saved.
Well, I mean, let me ask you this question. I mean, like, when the process is first starting to become a public thing, back in London, right? And were you wearing the robes at that point?
No.
When did the robes start to come in? The robes in the process symbol, which looks like a bit like a swastika. I mean, that must have been a very imposing thing to see on the streets of Chicago or New Orleans or New York or Toronto or wherever you were. When did the uniforms start to come into it, the robes?
The robes came in after we became a church, or technically a church in New Orleans.
Well, sorry to interrupt you, but is that to avoid American taxes by incorporating as a church, or you know what I'm saying? And so the robes were a way to, in the same way that the Church of Scientology would have people with clerical collars.
Right.
Oh, we're in the garb, therefore we must be
tax
exempt.
I don't quite as crude as that, but it's very much a question of identifying, ourselves as different from, and being identified as that as well.
But
so it's a question of personal identity. It's also a question of how one's seen from the outside.
Well, so does the group identity, at that point, if somebody in the hierarchy, the top of the food chain is saying, we're going to be a religion from now on, we must take on the trappings of a religion and the garb of religious workers or whatever, did the group look at that as a cynical thing, or did they self-identify and say, yeah, that's right, we are a religion now? How did, you know what I'm saying?
It wasn't quite as homogenous as that. I think a lot of people had different reactions to it, but we were so far into it by that time. You know, we were so much of a community by that time that I think even people who were a little taken back by it kind of went along with it. I'm somebody who you know, didn't grow up religious and didn't really fancy all this stuff, but because there was so much happening and I was gaining so much from the experience, you know, I went along with it, and I think a lot of people did that too.
Mm-hmm. Now, the full name of the organization was the Process Church of the Final Judgment.
Yes.
And there obviously were end of the world and apocalyptic elements to the process theology.
Certainly.
Was there ever a timeline or an end date that was set? I mean, were the prophecies something else that was going to come up in, you know, like there's all these people who are into the whole 2012 thing. Obviously, that's not too far from now, so they've got a very specific end time prediction that that doesn't happen. You know, what are they going to do with their careers?
Exactly,
but where the process, was there an actual timeline that was predicted? No,
there wasn't. One of the things that, and I think this probably came from Marianne, was 7-year spells of this was Jehovah 7 years, this was Lucifer 7 years, this was Satan 7 years, this was Christ 7 years. But I think even those 49 years have now run out. So no, I think we were sensible enough not to predict a particular time.
For that very reason?
Yeah.
I see. So
no, I don't think it was for that very reason, but I'm glad we didn't.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering what someone like Mick Jagger would have made of a bunch of, you know, robe-clad processions.
It was pre-robe.
Right.
And we were all part of the same, you know, same crowd in a way.
I see.
You know, same generation. We knew each other in different areas, went to the same parties and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, prior to the process, so it wasn't that far out. You know, it was before he was really famous.
Mm-hmm.
With other people, you know, we would meet on the street and they, you know, we would ask them a couple of quick questions and then that would go in the magazine.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I see.
So it wasn't quite as puffed
But
up.
the appearance was that they were sort of endorsing it in a sense of like, oh, you know, if Stephanie Powers and Marianne Faithfull are interested in this, therefore it must be okay, and you know that's must be part of the
I'm sure
reason
that was
for doing that.
Of course.
Well, at what point did it start to become far out? At the beginning of the interview, you said that after a while England got sick of you.
And we got sick of England as well. I think it was a double whammy. Robert did a couple of big lectures, one up in Oxford University and one at the London School of Economics, and he was roundly booed and jeered at. And of course it was absolutely humiliating in a sense. And I think that's probably what started to propel us out of England.
Was he a good public speaker?
No, not awfully good. Not awfully good. No, he was too cerebral, really, to be emotionally.
Well, I mean, but if he's the charismatic leader and he's, let's say, he's not that good of a public speaker, like, I'm just trying to figure out what is the glamour that would bring people into it.
It was entirely the glamour of mystery. I mean, Robert never appeared after that.
I see.
He never gave another talk. He never gave another lecture.
Now, let's discuss the Manson family connection, because Ed Sanders, in his book, The Family, and then he wrote some very damaging things, obviously, about the group, and there was a lawsuit over that. And then those same accusations were later picked up by Maury Terry, and then embellished even further in his book, The Ultimate Evil. And he connects the process to Manson and the Son of Sam slayings, and they seem to think that there was this vast, sleazy, underground, satanic network that, you know, drug sales, you know, murders, snuff movies. I mean, there's a lot of things, and you know, other nasty things. Is there any grain of truth in any of that?
No, not a grain. It was our fault for making ourselves so mysterious that other people could project their nightmares onto us.
But somebody interviewed Charles Manson for the death issue of
We went to see
magazine.
Charles Manson in prison. Now, I mean, you know, we weren't even in Los Angeles when all that was going down.
Mm-hmm.
We'd left Los Angeles 2 years earlier, so no, we had nothing to do with him at all. In fact, he had much more to do with Scientology than to do with us.
Oh, he claimed to be a clear.
Yes, he did.
Did he
And
not?
Wyllie,
Yeah.
yes, absolutely. No, there's absolutely nothing, no truth in it whatsoever. And the idea that Maury Terry goes on about German shepherds being killed, I mean, just because we had German shepherds, he then makes the assumption, oh, well, they must be the ones who are cutting the heads off German shepherds. We loved our dogs. We fed our dogs better than we fed ourselves. I mean, the idea that anybody there would kill a dog is so absurd. Absolutely absurd.
Well, was there a sex magic component to the process? Because in the book you tell of orgies, but the way that you recount them, it seems that they were more to break people down psychologically than for any sort of pleasure or even like a spell casting purpose. Is that true?
They went through, there were two phases of the group sex, and the first ones were, and again I'm having to deconstruct this in retrospect, but my sense was that Marianne was basically helping us release a lot of the English sexual repression. Right. And then later on, my sense was that she was using them to establish sexual guilt, so she could manipulate people through the sexual guilt, because no, they were not pleasurable. They were not pleasurable at all.
Well, if people were feeling psychologically dominated by her, that's an unpleasant feeling to have. Why did they stick around? I mean, was there what was the retention like in the group? I mean, did people join the process and stay?
Yeah.
They didn't. There wasn't a lot of in and out.
Certainly when they got, because you see, we made it so difficult to become what we call an IP, an internal processing, and somebody who actually lived in the community. It would take between 6 months and 2 years for somebody to get in, right? And they would have to give all their money over. You know, they would have to dedicate themselves completely, you know, to it. They would have to live in a special place with other acolytes, I think we call them, or disciples we call them, I think. So by making it so hard to get in, people would think very hard about getting out. Of course, there were people who left, mainly from the lower ranks, very few people from the higher ranks.
So how many inner circle members of the process were there at the height of it?
Well, the community itself was hierarchical, right? So we had, the inner circle probably was maybe 14, 15 people perhaps. And then around that were another group of maybe 30 or 40 people, and then around that was another group of perhaps you know, another 20 or 30. So I think at the most the community ever had was probably something in the region of 80 to 100 people. I mean, it was really very small compared to the Moonies or Scientology or something like that.
Right.
But because we were so outrageous, we made a much larger impact than the amount of people. Plus,
we had a magazine too.
Yes, and when you have you know, a group of people who are working 24 hours, well, whatever it is, 24 hours a day, you know, completely dedicated to one particular purpose, you can achieve an extraordinary amount of things.
Well, in each city where you had a process coffee shop,
chapter, yes.
right? Well, how many people would come, like in Chicago, for instance, or in New Orleans? How many people would show up for an event or for a ceremony or a musical performance? What kind of crowd did you get?
Probably generally between about 30 to 100, maybe. We would have a Sabbath assembly every Saturday, and we would get maybe 70 to 100 people to that. And then we were running all sorts of courses and classes. We were teaching people how to become telepathic, you know.
People would pay for this?
Yes, yes.
So how much money was the process raising at the height of the fundraising?
It's awfully difficult to say, but I would say probably we were pulling in, you know, maybe a couple of million a year, something like that.
A couple million a year?
Probably something in the region of that.
But the rank and file members were living sort of poverty-stricken lives, is that correct?
Well, yes. I mean, one can make it sound awful, very poverty-stricken, but we'd taken vows of celibacy, poverty, and obedience, and just the same as any monk does. So it wasn't the feeling that we were living in poverty. I think when people started realizing that Robert and Marianne were living in luxury, that it started getting a little bit awkward. But then again, you know, these were our leaders. You know, they had to get the best of everything.
So how exactly did the process split up? I mean, what caused the schism that resulted in Robert de Grimston, the Jesus, the charismatic Jesus of the movement, being cast out? the group?
It was firstly, I think, a fairly gradual affair. My sense was that when we lost the English court case, that's where a split just started. Now, there was always a tension between Robert and Marianne, and that tension grew over time, because my sense was that they didn't do as much work on themselves as we were all doing on ourselves. Mm-hmm. And I think around the early 70s or so, Robert, who was sexually repressed. He, for instance, in the orgies, he'd never take part in the orgies. Neither of them would. They would sit up there and sort of officiate. It's very strange.
Very strange,
very
yes.
Strange. But gradually the rows between them got more and more and more, and then one day, Marianne just had enough and kicked him out.
Timmy, thank you for being here today. It was really a pleasure to speak with you again.
Thank you, Richard.
Good luck with the book.
Thank you.